Welcome to a special edition of the Dust and Soap podcast. I'm your host, Rob Rogers, and we have Adaitya with us today. And we're going to talk...
Renowned scholar.
That's
fine.
You are a very...
Not renowned. It's not really renowned, so that's not really fair.
But today we're going to talk about Kāma, which is desire and all the things that are surrounded with it. So Kāmadeva, let's just start with who is he and where does he mostly show up?
Yeah, I mean, of course, he shows up all over the world. As Eros, as Cupid, he shows up all over the world. But Sanskrit literature, we were talking about the other day, that he shows up as early as Rig Veda. Maybe not as Kāmadeva per se, but as the abstract concept that he is the embodiment of Kāma. As of course,
in the primordial form, sort of, so to speak.
Right. As a abstraction rather than as a deity.
Right. And even in Greek myth, we have the same thing. From the Homer, or not from Hesiod's perspective, from the beginning of chaos, the first thing that happened was desire poured forth.
And it's really interesting too, because we could say that this is a big philosophical split in Hinduism, though it's very subtle. It only really matters to people who are really scholastically nuanced. But the Brahman of Vedanta doesn't want anything. Of Shankara's Vedanta, right? In the Upanishads, he says, "I am one. I think I'd like to be many." He wanted something, right? I mean, he at least willed something. That's a kind of Kāma. Whereas usually the Vedantic Brahman, the Shankaracharya's Brahman, he doesn't desire anything. It's all a big confusion. Whereas some of the Upanishads obviously have a Brahman that has Kāma, and Kāma is, and I'd have to think if there's a Puranic story for this. There probably is. But in the Devyatharva Shirsham, the encoding there of the mantra Kleem, Kamaraja, is Brahma Suhu, which means it's short for the son of Brahma. And that is given as an encoding for Kleem, which is Kamaraja Bija. So they actually do sometimes call him the son of Brahma. I don't know the story for sure. They do. He does sometimes bear that title. Now, when you get into the more tantric side of things, the tantric Shaivas and everything, they have no problem with the fact that Shiva has Icha Shakti, right? He has the power of absolute freedom and the power of will, and he did will everything that's happening, which is a very different circumstance than just a mass of confusion that's going on, that nobody started the fire, it's just been burning, and we all got here, it was already burning, and
Billy Joel didn't expect that one to come out. Nice.
as opposed to Shiva having struck the match and lit the fire.
Sure. That was also interesting, because normally we associate Shiva with Jnana Shakti.
Well, and that's actually a really, really great point, because if we get into this Kāma Kala Vilasa, it's very important.
First, can you describe Kāma Kala Vilasa first, or just what Kāma Kala is?
So Kāma Kala, you can take, of course, this plays with the word kala. Art, all the forms of art are kalas. Kala is limitation, as in a part rather than a whole. That's why the word in Sanskrit, sakala, means all, right? It means something sa with its kalas, with its parts, the whole of something. That's why we also, then you have a nishkala, right? You want to say something is partless, right? Or akala, what is that one in the pranam? We have, is it kala titam? She is beyond the kalas, beyond the limitations. So in some ways, actually a synonym of Shakti, because of that limiting factor, a synonym of Maya, of Shakti in that way, limiting the supreme. In another way, it's the art of Kāma, or it's the power. It can also be a power of Kāma. So it's often expressed as a union between masculine and feminine, because that's kind of the archetypical Kāma, right?
Well, right.
What is Kāma in the universe? The attraction between masculine and feminine.
Sure. Or for that matter, what desire implies something that's desired.
Right. the desirer and the desirable.
Yeah.
Yes. And or even the mutual desire, between them. So of course, in Sanskrit literature, we find this all the way down, to the grossest aspect. The most, when I say gross, I don't mean gross. I mean, physical, with a Kāma Sutra, right? The sutras on Kāma. And no, they're not all sexual positions. It's a sutra of Kāma Artha as one of the four aims of life.
There are lots of things that people don't know are in the Kama Sutra that, like even just flirting.
Are we PG-13 on here? Or
no, you go where you want, but
the Kama Sutras, I looked up a verse one time. I was so shocked. It has this discussion on like, some men have a very large penis and they match well with women who have a deep vagina, and some men have a short penis and they match well with women who have, and then they categorized each match, and like this match is a bad match, and this one's a good one, and this is it's like, it's they always make it a science, right? They always
very
categorize everything, and then they have a special name
exhaustively.
Right? And they make a name for each categorization, and then probably, I don't know if they got gunas in there or anything, but rate each. That's a good combination. Wow. That's a bad combination. So yeah, Kāma, right? Kāma in the most simple sense. But what's incredible about the word Kāma in Sanskrit is it is much more like the word eros than it is probably like any particular modern English word.
Right.
Because you call it desire, that's not just desire. You call it love, but we have certain connotations in the word love. You call it sensuality. There's almost no way you can succeed because we've split that concept apart so much.
Right. So for instance, like from the Greek perspective, we have two Aphrodites. We have the universal Aphrodite, and then we have the worldly Aphrodite. And that's one way that they separated her into sort of the agape sort of love that we have, and the type of Aphrodite that we're usually used to in the stories that we hear about. And so that's kind of one simple way that they separate her. Do you see any sort of analog for that in Sanskrit?
Yeah, well, there's actually a couple of analogs. I mean, one we could grab onto, maybe relatively easily is what we see happen in the tantras is, in the agamas, whatever we might call those texts, is that Kāma is pervasive, but he's pervasive as a seed form. Kleem is both the bija of Kāmadeva, and it's also often the Kāma Kala bija. Sometimes just the E, the long I by itself, Eem, is Kāma Kala bija. But Kleem is, if there's any bija associated with Kāmadeva, it's Kleem. And that bija appears all the time. It's almost never left behind, right? But then you think about, we end up with Om Kleem Krishnaya Namaha, Om Kleem Vishnave Namaha. So when Kleem, Kāma, they keep that Kāma sentiment, that Sringara Rasa, that romantic sentiment, all the things we associate with Eros, but when they put it under the umbrella of Vishnu, it takes a very different turn than when you take it by itself, right? So I don't, you do get a lot of Kleem with Vishnu, because there is a certain kinship between, say, Krishna and Kāmadeva, or Vishnu and Kamadeva in general. Vishnu is sometimes associated with Sringara Rasa on a whole.
Which is strange because, I mean, we don't know those stories. He definitely wouldn't associate through stories that connection.
Yeah. But with Krishna, you would.
Definitely would with Krishna. Yeah.
And when you think about that, Krishna is sometimes more popular than Vishnu himself.
Oh, definitely. He's definitely more popular than Vishnu.
Then it's not too shocking, right?
Yeah.
So that's one direction it goes. But otherwise, do we have a Kāmadeva who is specifically a spiritual energy, who is an agape kind of love? It's not always made clear. It is interesting. We do find 5, that there is a focus in the tantras that there are 5 or 8 forms of Kāmadeva. 5 is more popular. We find it a lot. If you look at Raja Shamala or Matangi's Yantra Puja, you'll find in the center, of course, is her. There'll be a triangle, and it'll be Rati, Priti, Manobhava. So it'll be Manobhava is the name of Kāmadeva, meaning born from the heart. We can say born from the mind, but Manas in Sanskrit is heart, mind. And if we're talking about Kāma, it's more so born from the heart.
Yeah, definitely.
In the heart, in the Manas in Sanskrit, of course, it's usually going to come instead of Buddhi because it's more sensual than Buddhi, which is another point. Hridaya, heart, in Sanskrit is not particularly sensual. It's more of a core of your being.
Absolutely.
The manas is more likely to be involved when the sort of English sensual heart idea as emotional center comes up, right? We have words like, have you ever seen hridaya hara? You know, like someone who's so beautiful, they steal away the hridaya? No, but you find manohara all the time, right? You don't find hridaya bhava, that Kāma was born from the hridaya, but you find mano bhava, that he was born from the manas. As the manas is more associated with the indriyas and the senses, and also emotions. So,
and the hridaya is more like the physical
core, the physical heart, but also the core of one's being. It's more about a center, right, as an essential element, than it is about the English association of an emotional heart.
It's less of a fluid thing. I see.
Yes, it could often probably be more of a synonym for buddhi, because buddhi is more internal than manas.
And more stationary.
More stationary, yes. Because in Sankhya philosophy, which spills into most things, you have Purusha and Prakriti. Well, they're separate, right? So the first tattva where they meet is buddhi, right? So buddhi is a huge deal because that's when Purusha and Prakriti interact. That's when this inner matter of Prakriti now becomes endowed with the consciousness of Purusha. And that's when stuff really takes place. So buddhi is very internal, right? So yes, I think it's more, I wouldn't say it's a synonym of hridaya, but it's closer to hridaya than manas is.
So another thing that just to pivot for a second, is from the Greek perspective, most of the stories activated Cupid or Eros is done by Aphrodite.
And how many Puranic stories have you read where Indra mobilizes Kāmadeva?
There you go.
Hey, Kāmadeva, man, I need you to go do this, you know?
That's so true. I forgot about that.
It is interesting, right? In any tradition, he rarely acts on his own. Isn't it interesting?
Yeah, like what's he doing in his spare time when he's not doing the deeds for these people who are, he's a hitman.
Yeah. Hey, man, I need you to go take that guy out with your arrows. Oh, you want me to do him in? Oh, I just want you to make him fall in love so he stops doing what he's doing. Seems fair. It doesn't seem very dangerous. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. Right.
Get turned to ashes.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Well, let's go over some of those stories first before we start talking about the actual weapons.
Oh, actually, I do want to throw in something more about that one, right? It does kind of give the idea that Kāmadeva's not a bad guy, that he's kind of neutral, right? The idea that when he's doing something that actually distracts a yogi or a rishi or someone from their spiritual path, he's being sent by Indra. It's very interesting, right? It means he's not out there doing that of his own accord.
Right. And that's, again, very analogous to the conversation that you get into with the symposium of Plato. People are trying to argue that he's the best of the best and all this stuff. And what really is the best and most compelling argument is that he's in between. He's neutral. He's not this or that. He is the full spectrum.
And take for instance this, which I think really plays this point. When Ramakrishna used to say, I don't know if I'm obviously paraphrasing, I'd be a little off, but in the spirit of that, he said bhakti was safer than jnana as a path because Maya is a woman and bhakti is a woman. Now, what does that imply? You know, he said jnana might fall in love with Maya, but bhakti probably won't, right? And he was saying basically, I think, you have a certain Kāma, right? There's a certain eros, there's a certain desire for bhakti because it's juicy and enjoyable. It fulfills your emotions and all these things, where jnana is not likely to do that. So jnana leaves a hole where maybe Maya would slip in, where bhakti fulfills that role of Kāma, right? By pointing it toward the deity, so you're not that worried about that. You can see how later traditions, the word Kāma loses its popularity. You know, the word bhakti or prema,
it becomes like a dirty word or something.
Yeah, and the word prema is not common in old texts. You know, I think it was actually picked up because it's not common. It's related with the same verb root, I believe, that priti comes from, which is one of Kāmadeva's wives. She is arguably the more plutonic one. Not that saying she is, but compared to Rati. Like Rati.
And what is priti exactly? How would you translate her?
Maybe closer to sneha, like, right? Maybe more like in affection, affectionate love. I only say that because normally she is very similar to Kāma, but you have to contrast her, right? It's Priti and Rati as a pair, right? And in that pair division, Rati is the one who is physical love, right? Romantic love. Even the word Rati in the word Rata, Uparata, certain words associated with it can be used for sexual union, etc. So yeah, lust, physical love, etc. Whereas then Priti actually occupies this more of a familial love or
social.
Yes.
Yeah, more
because
universal.
There's nyasas we find in a text like Ratyadi nyasa, the establishment of Rati and the others. Rati ends up in the at the base, either Muladhara, Swadhisthana, right? Like around the genitals. Priti ends up at the point of the heart, and Mano Bhava, which is Kāmadeva, the one born of the heart, ends up on the top of the head. So kind of, and for me, the way I see that is, kind of these three ideas of love. Here we have like a physical, a gross level, sensual love, physical love, as in like love making love, versus Priti, more of really an emotional love for someone, not necessarily physical in any way, an affection, etc. And then Mano Bhava, more so the pure eros, right? Unqualified, could go a lot of different ways, right? But just that power born of the heart or mind.
Right. And that's not exclusive to the heart and the genitals. It's kind of all encompassing of all of those. So really what we would most closely relate that to just the word libido in general, even though libido also tends to fall into that dirty category.
That's what I'm saying. As time in the world progressed, it's like terms got pushed one way or the other. Right? Like either like a term like affection, right? Like it moved very far away from like a romantic love, or a term like libido or eros or there's some other words I think of.
Or erotic for that matter.
Erotic. Yep. A lot of those words got pushed toward the
or
sexual.
Sensual, right.
There was some sort of force that made things kind of like pick a side, where these earlier terms like Kāma and eros were, they ran the gambit, And that's why even in later Sanskrit literature, here we are picking terms because now Kāma got forced that way, right? As desire, as lust, etc. As one of the enemies of yoga, right? People put Kāma in there, so it got pushed down this way. So then Bhakti and Prema, we needed some other words to take the upper path. Yeah,
and then we sort of have like English word like passion, which sort of does have it kind of rides the fence of, well, which way could it go? It kind of sticks. You could use
passion's interesting. Passion can go a lot of ways, right? Yeah.
So it's also interesting that you're just mentioning this because in this book that I'm reading right now, The Secret of the Golden Flower, we talk about the animus living in the head as the heavenly light, and then we have the heart being sort of the place of the union between the animus and the anima. And then below we have the anima as the waters of life ultimately, but also the unconscious, where ultimately it makes sense. That's also where we have the bits and pieces for sex and whatnot, and also all the senses of guilt and all the sense of shame that comes along with it, that gets buried in that unconscious, as well as all the words that they connotate. And it's always interesting for me to see comparabilities between different systems, and that's why, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say it's very interesting that in Sanskrit, because you really wonder where the idea came from, and not trying to say either way, that we have 5 Kāmadevas, because the 5 Kāmadevas, if you just take them on their name, you wouldn't necessarily be able to come up very easily in your mind with philosophically what they are right there. I'm going to try to remember them. I don't know if I'll get all 5. There's Kāmadeva. There's Kāmadeva. It's one name. There's Makara Dwaja, who has the sea monster or crocodile on his flag. That was
right.
Gosh, it's been a while. Oh, Kandarpa, usually translated as someone who causes Darpa, who makes people prideful or inflames them. So Kāmadeva, Makara Dwaja, Kandarpa, Mano Bhava, I'm pretty sure is there, born of the heart. And if the last one comes to me, I'll tell you.
Sure.
It's not like those tell you right on their face what they are, right? You have to really think about it. However, I do think I want to say the Greek system. They have
Yeah.
a very clear five
Yes.
loves,
Yeah. So
five eros.
there's it's similar to, I can't remember what Hindu text it is. It might actually be from the Ramayana or the Tulsidas.
Oh, the 9 forms of bhakti, Nava Bhakti. No, that's not
No,
it.
the forms of love. So we have agape, we have eros, we have mania, and there are the Greek words for like parental love and friendly love and brotherly sisterly love. And so those are sort of like the 5 different types, but we definitely have them separated, and you can just see how they fall into different categories. But yeah, I thought it was in the Ramcharitmanas. I might have been wrong.
No, I definitely, that makes sense. It could definitely, I mean, that's a big text. There's a lot of stuff in there.
Right. But yeah, same thing where we try and really what they are is, I think there are different intensities that go from something more universal to something more particular.
Right. Well, it's like the word, as you said earlier, the word passion helps in English because of its vagueness, right? We could talk about so many different kinds of passion, right? You say passion, you don't really know what direction we're going with it, right? Is this a passion to do something for the world? Is this a passionate, lust after a person? Is this a passionate anger? There's a lot of directions that passion can go. Is it passion to be a great parent to your child, right? Like there's the vagueness of the term helps because that's what we're trying to express here.
Totally.
When we say something like love or sensuality or eroticism, whatever, it seems like it's so defined. Love hopefully seems vague enough, but it even tends a certain way.
Well, it almost like it's used so much that it's almost a broken tool,
Yeah. But passion, what it tells you, and the reason it works so well as a term, is that it just tells you there's this great energy and drive, and it doesn't really tell you until you qualify it where it's going. And that's why it's a very good term for Kāma or eros.
So I think that's a perfect segue to start talking about the weapons themselves, or how the effect of Kāmadeva influences us. Because when, for instance, I was going through the Kilakam, there was the Uchatanadikam mantra, and I decided, because it said Siddhyantu Chatanadini Karmani Sakalanya piece. So the activities of the various of these various mantras in the attainment of these mantras, Uchatanadini, implies to me that Uchatana is one of the 5 arrows, and it mentions the other 4, but on the face of them, they're not super.
Well,
they sound dangerous.
That list, well, the list beginning with Uchatana, right, is specifically, actually, there should be 6 if it begins with Uchatana, because famously in the Tantras, there are this term obviously applies in a lot of things, but something that is also called the Shat Karmas, the 6 actions, but they are 6 magical acts, we can say, for lack of a better term, right? The reason, lack of a better term, is because the word magical is an incredibly loaded word. Magic is an incredibly loaded word.
You could say like enchantments or
ritualistic acts or whatever. They are supposed fruits that can be gained from certain tantric rituals, right? Because back in the day, it was an important thing. There was always the spiritual side. What are you going to do for you? But there was always the other question, and this is actually an incredible question. What are you going to do for someone else? Right. So it's actually an amazing thing. It's sometimes a great conflict that we find these days, right? Where we have temples and ashrams that are very focused on personal worship. And then it comes to communal worship. And you really have to ask yourself the question, if you're sitting there and you're always worshiping, right, only so that you can go closer to God, and you're saying, I don't want any benefits, I don't want any effects, etc. And now communal worship happens. Well, all those people wouldn't come if everything was only for, I don't want anything good to happen in my life, and I'm not trying to cure anyone's diseases, and I'm not trying to get any favors from God or anything. I'm just trying to, grow closer to God. That's communal worship doesn't exist purely in that form, maybe in, certain communities, but in general, texts promise it, and people are searching for it, some kind of benefit, right, from their worship. Even Krishna mentions the Bhagavad Gita, the person who wants something, the person who's suffering, the person who wants to learn, and the person who knows are all great devotees. So it brings up this question of, does your worship even suppose that it does something for the sake of others that they might want done? Now, these 6 actions, if you're going to go through them, on their face are quite extreme examples.
Right. And
they are the services that a tantric might offer to a king.
Right. And that was where I was going to go next with it, because I wanted to start with the history and then, kind of contextualize it. But like, this is 5 of the 6. Marana.
Is this from Siddha Kunjika Stotram?
Yes, this is from Siddha Kunjika Stotram. So it's Maranam, the power to kill or slay. Mohana, the power to delude or stupefy. Vashya, the power of suggestion or mind control. Stambhana, the power to petrify or make still. And Uchatana, the power to overthrow, upset, or cast away. Do you know what the 6th one is? Or
so Marana, Stambhana, Mohana, Vashikarana, and then you had Uchatana. It's going to be hard once you already have 5 there on the table.
Marana, Mohana, Vashya, Stambhana, Uchata, Nadaka.
We'll have to. I'm sure you could find it in a moment.
Sure, no, that's fine. But on the surface, this sounds like this Kāmadeva is a pretty pernicious person or a pernicious influence. And so let's just give a little bit of context around that, because in history, for instance, we go back to the Atharva Veda or something like that, where a lot of these enchantments find their origin.
Yes, Atharva Veda especially. Yes.
You want to go into that a little bit?
Well, Atharva Veda, it's actually because it talks so much this very conversation we're just having, that Atharva Veda is kind of the odd man out of the Vedas, right? Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, and Sama Veda are very tight with each other. I think probably, I could be wrong, but most of them even mention each other. I don't believe that directly Rig, Yajur, Sama Veda refer to Atharva Veda. So, it's sometimes people say 3 Vedas sometimes, right? Sometimes people say 4 Vedas, but not always. So Atharva Veda kind of had to make his own space for himself, and he tended to, I'm kind of personifying him here, but he tended to have lots of what might have even been considered at the time, and this is a little speculative, but folk religion, right? Like, okay, we're going to put a certain kind of amulet on your doorway, or we're going to make a certain protective array around the house, or, et cetera, also for kings, also for everyday people. And over time, the Atharva Veda tradition and the Jyotish tradition became very allied with the Jyotishi, kind of telling us what the bad omens were. They weren't only interested in the stars back then.
Sure.
They also looked at omens in the sky, omens on the earth, right? Later it became predominantly or only focused on the heavens, but it used to be earth, atmosphere, heavens, Bhur, Bhuva, Swa.
Right.
And the Atharva Vedan offering the solution, the upaya, right, to what the Jyotishi saw.
Right. And the Jyotishi being the astrologer.
Yes.
And the Atharva Veda essentially being like the overseer of all ceremonies, because we have more or less 4
they sought that position, but it wasn't always given to them.
Interesting. So we have the Hother, the person who's the master of the Rig Veda. We have the Yajamana, the master of the Yajur Veda, and we have the Udgatar, the master of the Sama Veda. And so these guys all specialized in one element of
right, and you needed
rituals.
all 3
and you read
to
it
do
all
the ritual.
To do the ritual, right? And so traditionally, the Hother is the one that conducts the wordings of the mantras. The Yajamana didn't really actually say anything. If he did say anything, he would just be muttering it as he was doing all the activities in the ceremony. And we would have the Samaveda, or the Udgatar, just during certain parts singing in this very interesting style.
Right. Well, they had 7 tones to everybody else's 3. So
right. So you get all these elements going on, and yeah, to set the scene of a setting like that, where all the community is getting together, getting all of these valuable things that are, hard work to make butter and to milk the cow and to have yogurt and all of these elements that ultimately wind up being an offering. It was a big deal.
And I think under that circumstance, the Atharva Veda argued. So then, as you were probably going to say, the fourth position of the Brahman was there.
Right.
And the question became, some people said the Brahman should be the master of all three Vedas. He should be a Trayi, right? He should be someone who possesses the three, right? He should know Yajur Veda, Samaveda, and Rig Veda as a kind of director or, overseer or whatever.
Yeah.
And the Atharva Veda said, well, we have all of these rituals that cure any bad omens, they cure any accidents, they cure any mistakes, right? They cure any inefficiency. So they were kind of arguing that the Brahman's role was to watch what was going on. And if he saw something happen that was inauspicious, or someone dropped something, or something that was pure became impure, or whatever, something was mistakenly offered into the fire, whatever, he would remedy that.
Right. He knew what mantra to make it right.
Yes.
Pause for 1 second.
Paused.
Sorry, dog barking. And play. Yeah, so you just keep going.
Yeah, right. So I think the Atharva Vedans, and you can imagine, right, that if you had these people who were, these were different schools, different lineages, right? It was not common that someone was a master of all three Vedas, or let alone all four, right? So when you talk about the Atharva Vedans saying he should play the role of Brahman, you can understand that the other three lineages maybe didn't like that, right? They were like, no, I don't want you to have that role. I want someone who is a master of all of our three lineages to have that role, right? Where the Atharva Veda as a tradition was saying, we should play this role. And it's a negotiation in real time. Because you think about, God, what was I thinking about recently? It was, it's just about how I think we almost imagine that points of doctrine or definitions of words or ways of doing some, specific ritual or whatever were settled in some text, and then everyone did them that way. There's no internet,
right?
Right? Even if someone figures it out over here, it has to move around in time and space from person to person. So you can imagine some, Shrauta sacrificers, some Vedic sacrifices over here. They've got the Atharva Veda integrated. That's how they do it. That's how it is, right? He's the Brahman. And over here, they've always had a guy who's a Trayi who knows all three Vedas doing it. And then someone comes from over there and says, I'm supposed to be a part of this. And they're like, no, you're not. You know what I mean?
Or for that matter, different areas required different things out of them. For instance, if you have a group that of warring factions, then there's going to be someone worshiping for their success in the battle, as opposed to other places where maybe it's just, they're just doing it because they want something, they want rain or
right. I think it's an incredible thing too, when you bring that up, like historical context is such a big deal in the sense that I think these days it's so easy for someone who feels spiritual or whatever to read a text that says maranam, slaying or killing is a siddhi, when it's incredible. Some people translate it as murder, which is really interesting because that implies that it's a crime, right? You're like, do you have a special power that's a crime to use?
Right.
It comes with an illegal sentence as soon as you use it. Like, wow, it's amazing, but contextually, you go back in time and you imagine all these different principalities, different tribes, different warring factions and stuff, and killing someone becomes a very different matter. Of course, if you could kill the enemy king, you could stop the whole conflict because your king could take over that territory and there would be no fight, right? I mean, people are always devising a way to get the other guy,
right?
Because if you could do that, you could save so much bloodshed and everything,
right?
That's like a special forces tactical division kind of guy if he has the power to kill a particular guy, right? I think that we instantly think about it in a modern society with the rule of law of one government across all the land, and then say, well, if you're killing someone, that's a murder, plain and simple. But we don't think that way when two governments fight each other. No one says, oh, think how many murders were committed in World War II. Because if they say that, they don't mean the soldiers killing each other. Because that doesn't fit our definition of murder. Soldiers killing each other doesn't count as murder. That's a battle. So in the same way, if you recontextualize such a city in a time and landscape when you don't know when a marauder was going to come over the mountain or whatever, that becomes a very useful tool. Just to say that it helps, because I think it's too easy in a day and age of not complete, but imagined safety to say, when would you need to do that?
So I think now that we have that background, I think it's really valuable to look at how we would psychologically now apply this in the modern day, because these arrows, when taken out of
I can give you another traditional set of the arrows powers too. I was talking about earlier.
Oh, right. Yeah, go ahead.
So very common, we actually find in puja still done, like Sri Chakra Puja, the worship of Lalita and everything. We find the arrows, they all have they are all sarvad and summed, meaning they are all made universal, because they all have the prefix sarva, and I think they all have the prefix sum. So they're made universal and total by the addition of these prefixes, right? So sarva saṃskṛta, right? Because I'm pretty sure these arrows are feminine. I have to think about that. Bane bio, they actually seem masculine, but because this one is in the terms of mudras, which represent the arrows. So the mudras are feminine energies. But sarva saṃskṛta, right? So kshobha, agitation, right? But sarva saṃskṛta, a total all agitation, right? Sarva vidravini. So this sarva all vidravini, this melting, this causing to run, right? This dissolving of solidity, vidravini. Sarva karshini, total attraction, because karsha is actually a push or a force, but karsha is a pull, right? So an attraction. Sarva vashankari, so that's still within the siddhis you were already naming. Vashankari, to control, to subjugate, really, because a vashin would be one who is a master, right? Who has subjugated. Even the Yoga Sutras actually uses the term. It talks about someone who has their indriyas, their senses, as vashata, meaning in the sta or twa, the condition of being vasha, subjugated, right? So that person might be called a vashin, one person who has vasha over his senses, right? So a subjugation, making you the master of something else, vashankari, right? Often cast in a sinister light, because when someone's trying to become the master of someone who doesn't want to be mastered, it's also, usually seems very sinister.
Quite slavery.
and then sarva-unmadini. So sarva unmadini, right? In mada, we would normally think of a kind of intoxication or madness, and then in unmada is like a kind of a wildness, right? It's this, like an extreme passion, actually. Yeah, right. a great excitement, or what was rapture, or exhilaration, etc.
So I just had a random question. Vaishya, is that related to Vashya at all?
Probably we would have to guess that is a guna sandhi of Vish, or right, because if it was an A, right, if it was Vasha, it would guna sandhi just to Vashya. So it's probably from a different root. Gotcha. But I actually have had that thought too.
Yeah.
So those arrows are a little more understandable. Maybe in the grossest level, you kind of think you have someone who is indifferent, right? Because they're thinking about, arrows here, Cupid, Kāmadeva. You have someone who's indifferent. So first is kshobha, right? They get a little agitated, right? Ooh, wow, that person's pretty, Vidravini, they kind of let go of all normally you're holding yourself back, right? There's this solidity.
All the boundaries get dissolved, and you're like
Vidravini. And then akarshini, right? This hold to the thing, right? Then vasha, now there's no escape, right? You have become you've been subjected by love.
Yeah,
you have become,
the subject.
And then unmadini, right? You're just totally lost in that exhilaration, right? All other consideration is gone, right? Forget being in your own control, right? Forget being controlled. You're just, that is just that total energy. So you can see that one in a little bit more of a
right, of a spiritual process
Well,
into
and so that
unity with the god or goddess that you're
right.
meditating on.
And that one comes right back to what we're saying about Ramakrishna's jnana and bhakti, right? The jnana as a man, so there's always a danger that you'll get attracted by Maya, but bhakti is a feminine word, right? Jnana being a man in the sense that it's a, it's actually, I think, is it neuter word? But it's not a feminine word, whereas bhakti is feminine. So it doesn't have as much a chance getting pulled in by Maya, in the sense that your passions and emotions and all can be at play in that devotion, right? Like the gopis longing for Krishna, where it's maybe a little hard to figure out where the emotional, passionate side of the self, the libido, comes into play in jnana, in the path of wisdom. That's why you can see this path as, kshobini, becoming disturbed in love for a person. But then, like you're saying, you can see the same in the path of devotion. And that's how it is for Sringara rasa deities like Lalita, because we are pretty indifferent, right? Most of the time to the divine. But every once in a while you get disturbed, right? Like, oh, but what about this temporary existence? What about God or something more eternal, right? And then Vajravini, you let go of those restrictions. The bhavana becomes deeper and deeper, right? And you can see that path.
Right. And so that's kind of where the reason for worship upon these various forms becomes useful, because we want to somehow understand this passion, this libidinous energy that is ultimately out of our control, and so therefore deities.
Well, and think about one of the words Ramakrishna loved the most, vyakulata. Have you ever looked it up in the dictionary?
I remember you talking to me about this a while back.
So
the
akulata,
right?
The word akula, the short A, I'm sorry, akula, you'll find in the Chandi, because it comes when the goddess, after drinking her spirits, right?
Stutters.
She starts stuttering and she speaks akula, right? It's not proper. It's a little messed up because she's quite inebriated. And then so you start with kula, right? Proper, right? From a good family, noble. Akula, not so proper anymore. The akula, right? It's a special kind of improperness, and it is an agitation, right? It is being very disturbed, actually. And then the ta is just the condition of being that, right? So to be very disturbed, actually, for realizing God or seeing God is vyakulata, right? It's a very libido kind of thing.
It's a strong yearning. It's a strong, like, I'm not comfortable right now.
I am not complete, and I need this other thing, right? I'm not okay. I'm kshoba. I am disturbed. I'm not solid. And it's interesting because that is the thing he emphasized. And of course, we can see, when you read about Ramakrishna, that was something he expressed in his sadhana, right? He believed if you had that crying for mother, you're disturbed without her, right? He used to say, if the child's playing with its toys, then mom goes about her work. But when the child starts crying, then the mother comes, right? When he throws aside his toys and won't be pacified.
And so, let's get a little into the strangeness of wrathful deities. And like, for instance, a friend of mine just pointed out this interesting idea that, for instance, Kali standing on Shiva, this image of a feminine figure possessed of the animus, so to speak. What makes that so pregnant with meaning, and how does that relate to what we're talking about?
Well, I think one, when we're talking about imagery, right? I think imagery tends to be more pregnant with meaning when it is incongruous with what your mind sees all the time, right? So I think when people see Lakshmi massaging Vishnu's feet, it's not, you don't philosophize about it very much. It doesn't stir up a lot of questions within you, right? This is very devoted wife and it's very divine God. That makes perfect sense. That's what I'd expect, right? If you suddenly see Lakshmi standing on Vishnu's chest, uproariously and proud, you say, well, what is going on here?
Whoa.
Your mind starts going into this inquiry, right? There's this energy activated. I got to solve this. This doesn't make sense. I have to understand this, right? And some people have understood it as simply as saying, to go to a Puranic story. I think it's a real Puranic story, where Kali was battling with the Asuras and she was mad and inebriated. No one could stop her. And then Shiva laid down. And when she stepped on his chest, she finally became embarrassed, right? She stuck out her tongue. She was embarrassed and she stopped, right? Now, that's probably not the original version of that. I can't say where the original one is, but we do know she's standing on his heart. If we read the Kali Dhyanam, even in the Cosmic Puja, right? It's Hridayopadi Samstitam, right? Situated standing on his heart. And usually it has a lot to do with a very common idea. This actually comes in the Kāma Kala of consciousness and energy, right? That the world is actually, and this is very true, and this is why the Shakti traditions are generally Shaiva traditions, because they're really Shaiva traditions that switch their focus to Shakti. Because they say, if Shiva is Brahman, right, he's this light of consciousness, illuminating Shakti, he's not really doing very much of what's going on in this world. He is the Sakshi, he sees it, he may even be the willer, he may will it, but he is the more so inactive partner. It is Shakti who is everything that we see going on, the thought, whether the thoughts in our mind or what's going on outside. So she is the one who is front and center. She's standing in the front. You see her, right? You see what's going on with her. He's just laying down there, the screen on which she's dancing, right? So I think that's just one, conception, is this, this predominance of the active aspect of the divine, and yet the presence of the other as well. She's not there alone, right? But she is there as the predominant active focus.
Right. But she's very fearsome.
Yes.
And she has limbs and skulls.
And there are fiercer ones than even that depiction. Yes.
For sure. Like Bhairavi, some of that stuff is
and this, if we want a little historical take on this, because there are depictions of Shiva that are very fierce like that too, the whole idea of Bhairava and everything, and even Rudra. And a lot of it comes from actually a lived experience of Kapalika sadhus, sure, but even before the Kapalikas, the Pashupatas and the Lakulas, people who lived their life in such a way as they were totally liberation seekers. With the Kapalikas, it might change a little bit, but the early Pashupatas, the Lakulas, early Shaiva tradition, people they would go and meditate for a long time until they were always repeating Shiva's mantra or Rudra's mantra and focused on him. Then they would have a phase where they went out in the world to earn people's ire, to earn people's condemnation, not to impress anyone, not to be loved, but to be rejected and still keep remembering Shiva the whole time. And after they could truly feel like they could withstand that, right, with no disturbance, that they were always constantly remembering Shiva, then in certain traditions, they would go to the cremation ground until they were able to perform utkranti and just exit their body, right? So, and they would go to the cremation grounds, right? And some of them wore skulls and all of these things, which are really symbols of the people most rejected from the world. That was a sentence for a murderer, right, to carry a skull. So when people saw you coming and begging for food, they weren't going to give you anything nice, right? They knew, because even though you were actually a Shaiva ascetic, right, a worshiper of Shiva, but they saw you carrying that skull, their assumption was, this guy's a murderer, right? Doing a penance for the worst possible crime, perhaps Brahmahatya. So nobody was respecting you and nobody was giving you something nice to eat, right? So there's a lived experience behind those symbols actually too. And that is kind of embracing the flip side of the world, right? Meaning a lot of us try to embrace the delightful of the world and, avoid being defamed and avoid painful experience and, food that doesn't taste good and sleeping outside and being insulted, all those things. We're trying to run away from those things, right? Where they're trying to say, I'm going to establish myself in Shiva and then show myself that the world intrinsically has these things within it. They're not avoidable, but they also have no effect on me if I'm really engrossed in that reality, right? Like it's one of those things like, this is just a silly example I'm just coming up with, right? Like, let's say you have someone who never eats spicy food, right? So like a hot pepper might be unbearable. you have someone else who says, screw it, I'm going to eat spicy food, I'm going to eat bitter food or whatever, right? And then, it doesn't really bother them. They might like it actually, but it certainly doesn't bother them because they've already experienced it, right? They're not avoiding an experience anymore. It's like if a person goes and sits outside in the cold and does that regularly,
right?
I don't think it's a big deal anymore. But if you're always avoiding it, wearing all these warm jackets, then when you're suddenly exposed to the cold, you're like,
yeah. Not avoiding it. I think that's a big part of the message here, because
it's there, right? It's there. Right. So if you never worship the fierce, right? If you don't have that in any of your depictions of divinity, they're all peaceful and they're all beautiful and no desire either, right? They're all, they're just all saints. And yet you end up with a sex scandal, right? Why did that happen? Well, because ignoring it doesn't delete it from the human psyche.
Exactly.
Violence, desire, etc. don't cease to exist. That was a Tanmai one once upon a time when I pointed out to him that we had this incense holder and it looked like it had a little face on it. They kind of looked to me like little goblin faces. And I was like, boy, that's an interesting, thing to put on an incense holder. And he said, well, that's a good place to keep your demons. You keep them right in front of you. You're very aware of them.
I love him. He's such an awesome dude.
If you put them in the back closet, you might forget they're there, but they're still there.
Or they're behind your back. So who knows what they're doing, right? If you keep them where you can see them, then
so if you and this is a real experience of mine. I'm sure you could share too, but I've had real experiences where I felt some energy come up within me, that just someone who rubs you the wrong way, right? And then just this aggressive energy comes up within you and your mind starts to view them as like kind of like an enemy, for lack of a better word, right? Because the mind has that programmed into it. Enemies have been a real thing in human, we're, because we're social beings, but we also have social instincts, right? And I, for whatever reason, that moment felt inspired to take up the name of Raktadantika, right? Which is a very ferocious seeming goddess, right? She with red teeth, right? Because she's devoured these asuras, right? Her teeth are this bloody red. And I brought up that name, not just to say the mantra, but to appreciate this idea, right? To me, she almost represented the predatory nature, right? Which exists within us as a hunter. You gotta kill the prey. You have to devour it, right? You have to protect yourself violently. If a lion comes, you can't negotiate. You can't keep things reasonable, right? You gotta fight. You have to be violent. Yes, you want to hurt the lion because if you don't hurt the lion, doesn't have any reason to leave, right? But so really, with that idea in mind, saying her name, just Om Hrim Raktadantikaya Namah, just with a Hrim, just a generic, just to appreciate her and say, this experience is within me, but you know what? It's not actually wrong or bad. This is actually something that has preserved humanity and animal life for millenniums. Without this, there would probably be no humanity. We all would have been eaten by something, right? Or we all would have been killed by the most violent person on the block if we weren't willing to, defend ourselves. And it just totally changed the experience. And I was trying to get rid of that feeling before, right? I was trying to fight against it, no avail, right? I was just like, geez, I know I don't want to feel this way, and yet I keep feeling this way. And then I switched around and said, you know what? I get why this is here.
Right.
This is important, and it's actually an energy, and it's a divine energy. It's a goddess. Totally. And then totally flipped it.
And that's the thing. These are all tools. These mantras, these yantras, these methods, these tantras, they're all ways of transmuting things that we just don't understand about ourselves, or that we have naturally programmed within ourselves to want to avoid, or to stay away from, or maybe even excessively long for. It gives us some sense of centeredness. And so just going back to these weapons, when we use the weapons on ourselves, immediately we think of weapons, and then we think, okay, well, that means I'm going to use these weapons on somebody else. And that's possible, as we talked about in the Atharva Veda, but it's also these methods are internally used as a sadhana. And by using them properly, all of a sudden we get that progress into not being triggered by those wrathful things outside, because we've already developed a relationship with those wrathful things within. So we've done our homework, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think it has to too. It's just the very, because weapons, of course, is kind of like, it's a tool, right? You think, well, it's a weapon. Well, it's an implement to do something. right? So to go to work, to get something done inside yourself. And, you think about the idea of just resisting something. You say, well, if I think something bad about someone, I'm just going to tell myself not to think it or whatever. It's even the story of the Chandi, right? They thought, let's just tell ourselves this is a stupid thought and get rid of it. In a certain way, and obviously you can't escape these things entirely, right? There's a certain neurotic aspect to that, right? This thought came, I don't want this thought, go away, right? And that doesn't actually create resolution. It's a sort of suppression, repression, resistance, etc. Whereas to flip it around and say, well, you know what, this is another intrinsic aspect of the universe. This is another beneficial aspect of instinct that has protected us, whatever, however you frame it, whatever allows you to get to that thought, that is more so gratitude, right? That is appreciation. And that I actually do think creates resolution, because it's a huge change of the energy, right? Resistance to something, there's opposition, but there's conflict in that, right? Like you're actually not taking energy away from the situation. You're kind of like adding another energy, and now you're going back and forth in your head, and and that instinct doesn't feel resolved. But appreciation and gratitude actually probably let the mind relax, because it says, oh, we couldn't be being grateful right now if we hadn't resolved this issue. I think even instinctually the brain thinks, well, if we're being appreciative right now, then surely we must have solved our problem. And kind of it dissipates, right? And you're able to come back to a peaceful place where the first instinct might be to argue against it, because even in the Chandi, Surat and Samadhi are like, hey, we're deluded by our attachments. Why is he attached to his family who kicked him out? Why am I attached to my kingdom I lost? We're in a beautiful, peaceful place. And we know it's stupid, right? We know we are viveka andaha, right? As if blind,
blinded,
not having no discrimination. And, the guy says, well, the solution is actually to worship that divine mother who is the cause of all bondage and liberation. And when pleased, she's going to let you go. Which at first take, you would say, oh, well, that's just, a ritualistic attitude or whatever. But not in the sense that he's saying as she is the energy of all, whatever is unfolding is her. And if you acknowledge her as Ya Devi Sarva Bhuteshu Bhranti Rupena Samstita, right? Well, you know what? You're this confusion too. And there must be a place for confusion, because I need to stop and be concerned when I don't know. So, thank God that I don't just keep moving through life when I don't understand and pretend that I do. Thank God I'm confused. That it's the same energy, it's all one mental energy, but now it's in a totally different place. And before you know it, it's not the energy of confusion anymore. Right.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so cool. But
it's back to this whole idea of libido, right? There's an energy, right? There's a libido present, whatever direction it happens to be moving in. And if you label it this or that, and you decide to fight with it, well, you're going to be fighting with your libido, and that's always a tough fight. Whereas if you appreciate it, it becomes redirected, and then it's the same energy, it's the same libido, but it flows in a direction that you want it to flow in.
Well, and it's also, it doesn't necessarily flow where you want it to flow. It's just that you have a relationship with it, and it generally is the more powerful aspect of our mind. I love the analogy that Socrates talks about in Phaedrus, where he says that there are two horses that are pulling the chariot, and the charioteer is the ego, and the chariot is the mind, and the two horses are your subjective and objective motivations, or your mind, I guess, your buddhi and your the subjective mind. You might say manas. You could say
well, it just always depends on how you're understanding at that moment.
You could say your hrid, your feeling, but I would say it's your libido, really, to be most objective about it, because the objective horse he describes as this, dainty white horse that's very stately looking, and always behaves very well to the reins and to the bit, and the other horse is super strong, but he's got a thick neck and he's obstinate, and every time he sees something that he likes, he yanks on the whole chariot, the reins. And so, it's just a beautiful description of how we don't necessarily have to understand the libido. The libido is beyond.
And you're right, and you're not trying to get rid of that horse. You're not like, oh, that's a bad horse.
That's the
because you're like, you don't want to be left with only that other horse.
That's your horsepower. Like really, like we were talking about a couple days ago. Somebody wishing that he didn't have desire. It's like, if you don't have desire, you got nothing. I mean,
why are you going to get up tomorrow?
It's also super important to have an objective mind, but the subjective mind is your horsepower.
and yeah, and like you're saying, as the symbol of libido, right? Like, or just the symbol of Shakti or whatever, like you have to work with it in a less direct way, right? And that is what these stories are pointing to, right? Like you can command your thinking mind, your buddhi or whatever, right? You can say, you control it. You can just think whatever you want to think, right? Oh, I don't want to be in conflict with this person. But that doesn't necessarily stop your energy, your unconscious, etc., from feeling a conflict with that person. Mm-hmm. It has to be worked with in a more, ironically, because it almost seems more primal, but it has to be worked with in a less direct way.
Definitely less direct. And also less
like a child.
Logical.
You can't just pull the thing out of their hand. They're going to cry.
Right. And I think another aspect of it is it's not reasonable. It doesn't necessarily need to adhere to a logic or a reason, or it doesn't have to feed into the intellect.
Just so perfect from the beginning of the Chandi, right? Because the king and the businessman both agree. We both know we're attached in a stupid way, and we should stop. And yet we're not.
But stopping. I can't do it.
But we know we should stop. But somehow that doesn't give us the power to stop. What's going on?
Right. Yeah, and so I think a lot of this is learning how to go with it, the going with itness of manohar, as you were describing before, as opposed to the hridaya. In some ways, like the hridaya is the centeredness of the buddhi, mm-hmm. and the manohar is the going with of the libido that helps us ultimately get most fulfilled.
And I think coming back around to aggressive looking or wrathful or whatever you want to say forms, deities, I think one of the reasons people object so quickly is because, just like with the libido, or just like with Shakti or love or desire or anything else, people see the potential for the negative there right away. Mm-hmm. Right? When you see something furious and with a weapon in hand, you think violence, someone could get hurt, right? If you see something alluring and sexy or whatever, you think, well, people are gonna, they're gonna get a little too free, and there's gonna be all kinds of sexual transgression and whatever, right? Because that's the relationship most of us have with it, mm-hmm. right? Like, ooh, you don't want there to be that powerful unconscious horse there, because what if you can't control him? Right. But he's still there, even if you don't represent him, even if you don't talk about him. Exactly. He remains present. That's why people are otherwise perfectly proper and nice, etc., can suddenly just flip and be so angry and violent. You think, how could that nice person? Well, just because they never paid any attention to their unconscious or those things within them didn't mean they were free from them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that goes back to this idea of our technologically minded self, and then our primitive self, mm-hmm. and how we oftentimes, as we progress and evolve through our life, we get more and more developed in these ways that are conventionally more common to the times, and we wind up leaving behind this primal sense of self that really is that connection, that wild man connection to that ability to understand or to have a relationship with the libido. And the more we leave that behind, the more we're scared of it, to the extent that all of a sudden, because we're scared of it, that means something bad, and we lose respect for it in that way. And all of a sudden, somehow the thing that triggers us is transmuted from something that's exciting and interesting into loathful and disgusting, mm-hmm. which it's just so peculiar. It's so but it makes perfect sense at the same time.
I think it's why it's like, and it's so interesting, because I think we see this split between the civilized and the primal within us all the time, in that we live in a world where a lot of the time we we believe it's okay for people to do or think anything so long as they dress it up as sophisticated man, right? And, not to get political, whatever people say, make America great again, or stop these people, stop these liberals, stop these conservatives, whatever they say. There's a certain, so long as you dress it up, well, it's because of this political reason, A, B, and C, it's because of this reason, or whatever, then you can suddenly be this primal person. But you're like, this probably how you feel about this, because if we laid out all the arguments and went through them, I doubt that everyone would say, we'll all agree to go with the most logical thing. Whoever can lay out the best argument that logically shows the greatest benefit for all people, we all agree to go with that. No one from either side would say that.
No.
Because deep down, there's a primal self that's involved, who isn't really playing the sophisticated self game, but he'll pretend to play it.
Right. Yes. And this again goes back to the going with it of the manohar and the centeredness of the hridaya. And when we have say for instance an issue that you don't agree with, let's just say, it's so important in my mind to be able to circumambulate the issue and at least find a morsel of understanding in that perspective, even if you mostly don't agree with it. At least.
Well, it's incredible, because I think one of the reasons people say, people say stuff like, I don't know if it's true or not, right? But a lot of people culturally, we say like, okay, at the dinner table, or like a family meal or something, no religion and no politics, right? Oh, is that because people are going to have very sophisticated differences and talk about politics? Well, I actually think that kind of free market economic policy penalizes small businesses over time, because large people with greater resources are less. Is that the kind of political conversation that people are thinking about? Why wouldn't they want that to be at the dinner table, right? They're thinking about two people's primal selves coming out through the guise of sophistication and
just having to.
And the words, the sophisticated words, have very little to do with where both the people are coming from in that moment.
Because the feelings are coming from the primal self, and those are the most loud forms of communication.
And wouldn't it be incredible, because it almost seems culturally wrong, right? If both the people just said very passionately to each other, I feel afraid and concerned.
Yeah, right.
And it's because I feel afraid and I feel disadvantaged and I feel like I'm going to get cheated that I have a hard time talking about this topic. Would be incredible thing to say.
Right. And it's much closer to the truth. And it takes a lot of courage to be that vulnerable. And I think that's the strength of the primal self, is this ability to, when I think of the primal self, I think of Rudra. I think of this, he's so gentle. He's Pashupati, and he's the man of the woods. And so he's just like, but at the same time, he's a warrior, and he also kills animals. And this duplicitousness of the deities is another thing that I think helps to show us that the world requires more than just a binary process of thinking.
Yeah. And also with the a lot of the fierce deities comes the symbolism of cremation grounds all the time, the symbolism of death, which again, very, like thing that people generally would not like in their religious experience. Maybe I don't want to bring that up. I don't want to focus on that, but it's an incredible thing to positively embrace, right? To be able to say, I'm going to end. So it can't all be about me, and it can't all be about right now, because this expires. And it's incredible to keep that in mind, right? It's incredibly transformative thought to have, right? Because a lot of the time we do live in a world where it's just even by design, right? That death is hidden. It happens in a hospital and in a proper area, and
it happens to other people.
And we don't really go to those areas, right? You're not going to a graveyard. Maybe a loved one there, you'll go, but you're not just going to the graveyard, right? Wherever death is, Keep that
Right.
somewhere else,
Right.
right? Where it's a whole nother thing, because it is something very within the primal man, the idea of, I'm limited. I'm not going to make it out of this, at least not in this form and with this mind and with this perspective. And, in many ways that could help one soften their perspective. Because I think we talk a lot in this world. I think people are very big on being principled, right? Never compromise on your values. Well, you're going to die.
Right.
You are going to compromise. Everyone around you might have to wait till you're dead, but you're going to compromise.
Yeah.
Warren Buffett could say, I'm going to run this company the way I've run it. I'm not going to let it be run any other way. But you're going to die.
Yeah.
Warren Buffett's going to die. Someone's going to do it, and he's not going to have the power to direct how they do it. Right. And so to accept that fact while you're alive is incredible, can be incredible. And that also comes with the fierce deities, which is God's going to destroy me at some point. Yeah, it might help me along the way, but he's going to get rid of me too. He's already done it to a billion zillion people who have come before. He's got a whole pile of graveyard.
I think I'm going to make an exception for me.
he's taking me down too. She's got that garland of skulls on. She's letting you know you're going too. We're all going.
I think that is a perfect and most natural way to end. But it was really
too on the nose, but yeah.
No, I think it's perfect. Honestly, on the nose, I don't know. On the heart, as far as I'm concerned, that was the discussion about libido, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Adaitya for sharing all of your wonderful wealth of knowledge. It's always it's really fun to just kind of go on a ride.
yeah, and I hope we'll keep going with it, because man, we didn't even get to Kāma, Vilasa. We have so many places we can still go with it.
Totally
it's so fun. So this has been Adaitya and I, a slightly more renowned scholar from having broadcasted. How about what's the opposite of renowned? Obscure. The obscure scholar. The world's most obscure scholar.
Yeah, but only
but
not
if
for
you were the
long.
world's most, you would be renowned, and then
you'll probably become renowned once you're dead. No.
Yes, well, no, it's
anyway.
very real.
No. So yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. Tune in next time. We'll see you.